Good evening, everyone. I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the Unterberg Poetry Center, and it's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's celebration of Vladimir Nabokov. Tonight's event is also being webcast live to colleges and universities around the country, and I'd like to welcome that audience as well. The dissemination of Poetry Center programming, both live readings and those from our archive, is made possible in part by a grant from the Frank Foundation. We are also grateful to the following individuals and institutions for their season-long support: the Greenwood family, the National Endowment for the Arts, Eva Usdan, Joan and Jack Jacobson, the Kaplan Foundation, Amazon, and the New York State Council on the Arts. I would also like to say thank you to tonight's sponsor, the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation. This evening's program, which will last about 90 minutes, features 2 presentations and 2 readings. Afterwards, everyone is invited into the art gallery just next door, where some of the actual note cards from Nabokov's draft of the original of Laura are on exhibit courtesy of Christie's. Copies of Laura will also be available for purchase at that time, courtesy of Barnes & Noble. As many of you know, Nabokov read at the Poetry Center just once over the years, in April of 1964. So before we begin, we thought we'd play an excerpt from that recording. Here then is Vladimir Nabokov reading one of his favorite poems, The Ballad of Longwood Glen.
I shall begin by reciting the Ballad of Longwood Glen, which is a short poem I composed in Wyoming, one of my favorite states of existence. It is also one of my favorite ballads. That Sunday morning at 10:30, 2 cars crossed the creek and entered the glen. In the first was Art Longwood, a local florist, with his children and wife, now Mrs. DeForest. In the one that followed, a ranger saw Art's father, stepfather, and father-in-law. These 3 old men walked off to the cove. Through tinkling weeds, Art slowly drove. Fair was the morning with bright clouds afar. Children and comics emerged from the car. Silent Art, who could stare at a thing all day, watched a bug climb a stalk and fly away. Pauline had asthma, Paul used a crutch. They were cute little rascals, but could not run much. I wish, said his mother to crippled Paul, some man would teach you to pitch that ball. Silent Art took the ball and tossed it high. It stuck in a tree that was passing by. And the grave green pilgrim turned and stopped. The children waited, but no ball dropped. I never climbed trees in my timid prime, thought Art, and forthwith started to climb. None then his elbow or knee could be seen in a jigsaw puzzle of blue and green. Up and up Art Longwood swarmed and shinned, and the leaves said yes to the questioning wind. What tiaras of gardens, what torrents of light, how accessible ether, how easy flight. His family circled the tree all day. Pauline concluded, Dad climbed away. None saw the delirious celestial crowds greet the hero from earth in the snow of the clouds. Mrs. Longwood was getting a little concerned. He never came down. He never returned. She found some change at the foot of the tree. The children grew bored. Paul was stung by a bee. The old men walked over and stood looking up, each holding 5 cards and a paper cup. Cars on the highway stopped, backed, and then up a rutted road waddled into the glen. And the tree was suddenly full of noise. Conventioners, fishermen, freckled boys, anacondas and pumas were mentioned by some, and all kinds of humans continued to come. Tree surgeons, detectives, the fire brigade, an ambulance parked in the dancing shade. A drunken rogue with a rope and a gun arrived on the scene to see justice done. Explorers, dendrologists, all were there, and a strange pale girl with gypsy hair. And from Cape Fear to Cape Flattery, every paper had man lost in trade. And the sky-bound oak, where owls had perched and the moon dripped gold, was felled and searched. They discovered some inchworms, a red-cheeked gull, and an ancient nest with a new-laid ball. They varnished the stump, put up railings and signs, restrooms nestled in roses and vines. Mrs. Longwood, retouched when the children died, became a photographer's dreamy bride. And now the DeForests, with 4 old men, like regular tourists, visit the glen, munch their lunches, look up and down, wash their hands, and drive back to town.
A hard act to follow, and a less exotic accent. Hi, I'm Brian Boyd. I've called this, and I hope some of you know why, on some index cards entitled The Original of Laura. As Nabokov's biographer, I was the first person other than Nabokov, his widow and son, to read The Original of Laura. After years of imploring Vera Nabokov for access to the manuscript so that I could write accurately about VN's last years in his final but unfinished novel, she allowed me to read it in 1987, 10 years after her husband's death. Once only, without taking notes, and under her eyes, which were trained on me like a drill. When Vera and Dmitri later asked me what I thought they should do with the manuscript, which Nabokov had asked Vera to promise to destroy, I said, to my own surprise, destroy it. How glad I am now that they ignored my advice and that their attachment to Nabokov's work overrode even their respect for his last wish. The Original of Laura could have been published badly, as if it were a new Lolita, or at least a new Pnin. Instead, it has been better published than I could have imagined. Subtitled A Novel in Fragments on the cover, and Dying is Fun in brackets on the title page, the index cards, now bound into book form, rightly flaunt their unfinishedness. Readers should not expect a new story to rival Lolita's intensity, or a new character to match Pnin's pathos, but instead glimpses of a famously challenging writer still challenging his readers and himself in his late 70s, with death closing in. What troubled me so much when I first read The Original of Laura that I recommended that VN's wishes should be followed and the text destroyed. And what has changed so much in my sense of the novel that I can welcome not merely its preservation, but its publication as, in one reviewer's words, the literary event of 2009. I've seen my initial disappointments echoed in the responses of good reviewers. My first disappointment was that the fragments remain just that. I knew that Nabokov had had the first idea for the novel almost 4 years before his death, and that when he had still more than 14 months to live, Vera had reported that he was about halfway to completion. I'd expected much more than I found. The second disappointment was that there were no sympathetic characters, and no characters who loomed large in the imagination, like Luzhin, Humbert, Pnin, Kinbote, or Van Veen. The third was that the narrative driveshaft seemed broken. In Lolita, Pale Fire, and Ada, Nabokov reinvents fiction without forfeiting the pleasures of plot. The original of Laura has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it's hard to see how readers would have been impelled from one to the next, even if the novel had been completed. The fourth disappointment was the recurrence of rather unpleasant sex, as in Transparent Things, and of a Lolita theme. Nabokov had recycled the name of Lolita, or much more, in Pale Fire, in Ada, and in Look at the Harlequins. In the original of Laura, he introduces a character called Hubert H. Hubert, the partner of Flora's mother. When his hand touches 12-year-old Flora's legs under the bedclothes, she kicks him in the groin. Do we really need a fourth reprise? The fifth disappointment was that the hero had a problem too strange to engage the imagination. Luzhin's love of chess in the defence haunts even readers who cannot play the game. Humbert's desire for Lolita compels readers, despite their feelings about child rape. But in Look at the Harlequins, Nabokov's last completed novel, Vadim Vadimich's maddening problem is merely that he can't imagine turning around to walk the other way along a street, an act that he can perfectly readily perform in real life, but that sends his imagination spinning, a problem that has always failed to turn my imagination. And in the original of Laura, Philip Wilde wants to find out how to will his own body dead, inch by inch from his feet upwards, so that dying becomes fun, becomes a willed and reversible relief from the itch of being. Most of us surely think about death, and most of us have times when we wouldn't mind recasting our bodies. But Philip Wilde's obsessive quest seems far from ordinary human obsessions. The sixth disappointment was the novel's style. In a 1974 review, a stern young writer named Martin Amis had greeted Nabokov's last completed novel, Look at the Harlequins, in these words: "The really unnerving deficiency of Look at the Harlequins is the crudity of its prose. In the book's 250-odd pages, I found only 4 passages that were genuinely haunting and beautiful. In an earlier Nabokov, it would be hard to find as many that were not." Like Martin, I was also sadly disappointed by Look at the Harlequins and wondered, did it mark an irreversible decline in Nabokov's powers? Yet he still sparkled in interviews and introductions. As Nabokov's biographer, I wondered, as I picked up the first of the Laura index cards, would I be able to describe Nabokov's invention as undimmed, or would the manuscript confirm a decline? My fraught first reading, alas, bore out my fears. Above all, I felt that whatever might have become of the novel, had he finished it, the cards that survived fell far short of Nabokov's standards. They should be destroyed as he wished. Those of you who've not yet bought the original of Laura must now be thinking you can save the money you'd budgeted for. Now I want to change your minds. And rest assured, I'm not someone who approves of Nabokov whatever he writes. I've sometimes been harsher than anyone on those of his works that I think are not up to his usual standards. Okay, a message from above. My estimate of the original of Laura has changed dramatically. It's not another Lolita or Pale Fire, but I think it could have been, it already is, another fascinating Nabokov novel and a priceless entry into his workshop. What's changed my mind? Not reading under impossible conditions. Not reading with the wrong expectations. Reading for what's there and not for what's missing. Rereading. And re-rereading. My first disappointment was that the novel was so fragmentary, so unfinished. It still is, but there's a strong beginning, a vivid middle, and a wry end. The more I read, the more I think that Nabokov may indeed have been near halfway to another short novel like The Eye or Transparent Things. My second disappointment was in the characters. True, there are no sympathetic characters, but Flora is deliciously unlikable. And her husband, Philip Wilde, an unforgettable presence from his tartan booties and his ingrown toenails up through his Buddha-like bulk to the head trying to erase his feet. More in a moment. My third disappointment lay in the plot. But if there's little plot tension, there's also headless action from reckless Flora and comic inertia from Wilde's repeated self-erasures. Many of Nabokov's novels, 1 out of every 2 by my count, develop no powerful plot impetus. Unless I'm mistaken, as you know by now I can be, the original of Laura would have offered different pleasures from those of suspense, the contrasts of helter-skelter narration and meditative stasis, and the puzzle of who exactly has created and who has obliterated whom. 3 disappointments down, 3 to go. I'm sure you're still far from persuaded. My 4th disappointment, the frequent focus on sex and the replay of the Lolita theme. Why I found the first of these disappointing on first encounter, I now can't imagine. I now find Nabokov's descriptions of sex here hilariously unappetizing, prodigiously unsatisfying emotionally and often physically, and comic in their painful shortcomings. Just forget the tension of Lolita, or the ecstatic, and I quote, passionate pump joy release of Ada. Forget, above all, the romance of first love in Speak Memory or in Mary. So here's your first, for some of you, your first encounter with the text of the original of Laura. Flora was barely 14 when she lost her virginity to a coeval, a handsome ball boy at the Carlton Courts in Cannes. 3 or 4 broken porch steps, which was all that remained of an ornate public toilet or some ancient template, smothered in mints and campanulas and surrounded by junipers, formed the site of a duty she had resolved to perform rather than a casual pleasure she was now learning to taste. She observed with quiet interest the difficulty Jules had of drawing a junior-sized sheath over an organ that looked abnormally stout and at full erection had a head turned somewhat askew, as if wary of receiving a backhand slap at the decisive moment. Flora let Jules do everything he desired except kiss her on the mouth, and the only word said referred to the next assignation. Nabokov has focused on sex before, but never has he shown it so divorced from feeling. But he surely makes us feel amused and appalled in a new way by the sex he depicts. The Lolita theme offers even greater surprises. Nabokov evokes Humbert Humbert here, not to replay Lolita, but to make the most of misleading our expectations. Mr. Hubert H. Hubert lost a daughter named Daisy at 12, run over by a backing truck as she took a shortcut home from school. He sees her, in a sense, resurrected in Flora, Daisy's age when she died, and wants to be nearer Flora than she wants him to be. He wants even to brush her hair with his lips. But as far as I can see, he feels toward her only as a father of a lost daughter whom Flora keeps reminding him of. Flora, who knows about sex, but not about love, misreads his intentions, as do readers, and I may add reviewers, misled by Nabokov's expert deception. The real link to Lolita that we should make from Hubert H. Hubert, I think, is not to Humbert crushing Lolita under his memory of Annabel Lee, but to a very different image from Lolita, the Casbeam barber, whose appearance Nabokov, in his essay on a book entitled Lolita, identifies as one of the nerves of the novel, the secret points, the subliminal coordinates by means of which the book is plotted. A sentence that he reports cost him a month of work. And I quote from Lolita. In Casbeam, a very old barber gave me a very mediocre haircut. He babbled of a baseball-playing son of his, and at every explodent spat into my neck, and every now and then wiped his glasses on my sheet wrap, or interrupted his tremulous scissor work to produce faded newspaper clippings. And so inattentive was I that it came as a shock to realize, as he pointed to an easeled photograph among the ancient grey lotions, that the moustached young ball player had been dead for the last 30 years. Hubert H. Hubert feels tender love for his dead Daisy and would like to offer the same to Flora, but Flora understands only sex, not love, not tenderness, and repays his attentions with a kick in the groin. This scene in the original of Laura presents us with apparently creepy farce, but underneath it, I think, lies one of the nerves of the novel, one of its secret points, a death not erased for the father who remembers his lost child so painfully, so hopelessly. My fifth disappointment, that Philip Wilde's obsession with willing his own death, erasing himself by inches, so that he can restore himself by inches, so that death can sing to his tune, seems so remote from our experience and our desires. Wilde's quest is certainly singular, but many of us have wished to erase intense pain or shed excess weight. Wilde has both. Many have sought to train the mind to control and transcend self through meditation, and Wilde has not only the shape of the fattest Buddha, but the same urge to reach nirvana, to eliminate the self. In Wilde's case, life has humiliated and pained him with his enormous bulk and his abscessed toes and writhing gut and the, quote, anthology of humiliation, unquote, that his life has been since he married Flora. Some of you will know that anthology derives from the Greek for collecting flowers, but in Wilde's case, his Flora casually plucks and casually or viciously discards other men. Nabokov has some sympathy with Philip Wilde in his humiliation, and so should we. All the same, Wilde is no Pnin. All of us might wish at times we could control our own deaths or our own restorations to life. But Nabokov surely presents Wilde's as exactly the wrong way to transcend death. The only transcending of death that Nabokov could imagine wanting will somehow take the self through death and escape the enclosed self, but not deny it its accumulation of experience. I am ready to become a floweret or a fat fly, John Shade writes in Pale Fire, but never to forget. In Ada, Van Veen explains the worst part of dying. The wrench of relinquishing forever all one's memories. That's a commonplace. But what courage man must have had to go through that commonplace again and again and not give up the rigmarole of accumulating again and again the riches of consciousness that will be snatched away. Wilde obsessively tries to eliminate himself, to place his body under the control of his mind, but for Nabokov, self-elimination can only be the falsest kind of self-transcendence. Wilde's ingrown toenails cause him agony, and for once, as he lies in a mattress in his bath, willing away what he can of his body, he not only seems to erase his toes, but decides not to restore them when he emerges from his hypno-trance. When I opened my eyes, I saw at once that my toes were intact. After swallowing my disappointment, I scrambled out of the tub, landed on the tiled floor, and fell on my face. To my intense joy, I could not stand properly because my 10 toes were in a state of indescribable numbness. They looked all right, though perhaps a little paler than usual, but all sensation had been slashed away by a razor of ice. I palpated warily the hallux and the 4 other digits of my right foot, then of my left one, and all was rubber and rot. The immediate setting in of decay was especially sensational. I crept on all 4s into the adjacent bedroom and with infinite effort into my bed. For many, over many millennia, but never more than for Nabokov, transcending death has seemed somehow akin to overcoming the power of gravity. Fat Wilde, flopping over on erased toes, succumbs more grotesquely than ever to gravity. And his whole obsessive quest seems an apotheosis of self and of stasis, a self-fixated and self-enclosed attempt to circumvent the limits of the self that death imposes. To the extent that Nabokov imagines death, and you may have noticed that that's to a very considerable extent, he sees it as a transition that hurtles the self into a state retaining accumulated selfhood, but no longer subjected to what he calls the solitary confinement of the soul. Wilde conjures up an image of a capital I, our favourite pronoun, as he says, on his mental blackboard. It's 3 bars representing his legs, torso and head, and he sees his auto-hypnosis as akin to erasing successively each bar of the I. Images of erasing or self-deleting pervade the whole novel in ways that reveal Nabokov's customary care in constructing and concealing his patterns. To take one example, Wilde feels delight and relief at erasing the pain of his abscessed ingrown toenails. Flora, by contrast, wipes not a mental blackboard, but her own flesh. She requires her menfolk to promise to withdraw before ejaculation and promptly wipes the semen off her groin, or as the novel once phrases it, her ingwen. How many here, outside those in medicine, know this word for groin? I would ask for a show of hands, but I can't see with the lights. Ingrown inguine. Nabokov covertly links Wilde erasing his own life, rubbing out his toes, with Flora briskly rubbing off the possibility of new life. The Roman Flora was a fertility goddess. Nabokov's Flora is a sterility goddess. A sterility goddess married to a doomed rubber-dummy Buddha. Art offers another kind of immortality in Nabokov, another promise of surpassing death. But not here, not in this novel. Flora's grandfather, painter of once admired sentimental landscapes, falls precipitously out of favour. What can be sadder than a discouraged artist dying not from his own commonplace maladies, but from the cancer of oblivion invading his once famous pictures, such as April in Yalta or The Old Bridge? His son, a photographer, films his own suicide, his being rubbed out. The photographer's wife, Flora's mother, known only by her ballerina surname Lanskaya, has her art fade as her body ages. Flora herself becomes the subject of a kiss-and-tell novel, My Laura, whose aim is not to immortalize her, but to expunge her. And again I quote, "The eye of the book is a neurotic and hesitant man of letters who destroys his mistress in the act of betraying her." The laurel was associated with literary immortality because its leaves last so long even after they detach from the tree. Flora, so eager to have herself deflowered, still remains alive at the end of the original of Laura. Unlike her husband, obsessed with his own death, she ends the original of Laura, refusing to look at the novel My Laura and at what she's told as your wonderful death, the craziest death in the world. Are you starting to feel keen to read the original of Laura before I disclose too much? I hope so. We move to my sixth disappointment, the novel's style. For the once young and the still stern Martin Amis, this by itself would be decisive. In 1999, for the centenary of Nabokov's birth, the Nabokovian, the oldest of the 5 journals devoted to Nabokov's work, decided to stage a Nabokov write-alike contest. A panel of judges selected 3 submissions, which appeared in the centenary issue, along with what were announced as 2 never-before-published pieces of Nabokov's prose, in fact, both from the original of Laura, that readers were informed Dmitri had supplied. Delightfully, most picked as Nabokov's a passage by Charles Nicholl, an academic and writer who'd been publishing superb work on Nabokov for over 30 years. And no one picked his passages from the original of Laura. Nobody picked Nabokov as the one who wrote most like Nabokov. What does that tell us? I think it tells us that even Nabokovians either misconstrue Nabokov's style or underestimate how new it can be from work to work. There are many hallmarks of Nabokov's style that we can recognize on sight when we see them on sight. And we can find many of them already on the construction site for the original of Laura. But I think we've recognized too little how much Nabokov also modifies his style and weights particular features differently in each work. To take his best English works, the high, controlled elegance of Speak Memory differs radically from Lolita's neurotic twitchiness, and both from Pale Fire's radiant craziness, and all 3 from Ada's Rococo supersaturation, and all 4 from the original of Laura. The fact that no one picked the Laura passages in the Nabokov write-alike contest indicates to me not that Nabokov's not writing up to par here, but on the contrary, that he's playing his usual game of changing or reinventing his game subtly to suit the special world of the work. Nabokov has a reputation, not undeserved, of being a great prose stylist, perhaps even the greatest. The original of Laura makes me want to rethink what constitutes the distinctively Nabokovian. Not just high prose, a recondite vocabulary, elegant quicksilver sentences, minute precision of visual detail, pointed allusion, foregrounded verbal combinatory play, lucid elusiveness. His style may be most extraordinary not so much as prose, but as story. Unlike Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, the 13 words of the opening sentence of the original of Laura would win no place in dictionaries of quotations and no prizes as prose, let alone as Nabokovian prose. I won't cite them now, you'll have to wait for later in the evening. But believe me, taken out of context, they'd be plain words, muffling even their plain declarative force with a doubled concession. But as storytelling, I think, the first sentence of the novel astounds. It does more as story than we had any right to expect of a first sentence until now. All his writing life, Nabokov stressed narrative transition as the most demanding skill for the storyteller to master. The transitions between character, description, report, speech, reflection. He sought new ways to shift from one to another, new ways to speed up the shifts or slow them down or highlight or veil them. He wanted both to extend the possibilities of storytelling at every moment and to show readers how nimbly their minds can move from present to past or possible future, from outside a character to inside, from here to there, from actual to possible or impossible, counterfactual or suppositional. In my latest book on the origin of stories, Evolution, Cognition and Fiction, a little hint for your Christmas shopping list, if you can stand to wait that long. On the origin of stories, which after the epigraph never once refers to Nabokov, I marshal the evidence that we've evolved into a storytelling species, and that the key reason we've done so is because stories improve still further the social cognition that had already reached such an extraordinary level in our species. From childhood pretend play to adult fiction, we speed up the capacity of our minds to shift beyond our here and now by taking on new roles, sidling and sliding this way and that through time and space and minds and modalities, thanks to the high-intensity doses of social information that we deal with in fiction. No one has taken this further than Nabokov does in his last novel. I think that for centuries, narratologists and novelists alike will focus on the opening chapter of the original of Laura as proof of the new finds still to be made in fiction. The original of Laura starts with an answer, but we never learn the question, and we never quite keep up with the pace of the story. The novel reminds me of the myth of Atalanta and the golden apples. At top speed, it picks up a stray fact, darts aside, nonchalantly drops one subject, gathers up another, and still races ahead, unless it slows down and all but stops with Philip Wilde as he tries again and again to erase himself. Nabokov not only rewrites narrative texture, but from novel to novel reshapes narrative structure. In the original of Laura, he plays with self-erasure. Philip Wilde tries to erase his body by degrees. The author of My Laura aims to eliminate Flora. But when I read out the first chapter of the original of Laura at the end of the evening, I'd like you to listen also for the unprecedented way that Nabokov makes the narrator imply himself and conceal or erase himself throughout. Don't expect in the original of Laura the high lyricism of sentiment and sentence that we find in Lolita, Pale Fire and Ardour. Instead, look for how much Nabokov does, once again, by inverting what he values most, but, as always, in a new way this time too. The way he inverts love as a way to self-transcendence, through procreation, through the tender attunement of lovemaking, through sharing a life with another. All inverted in Flora as a sterility goddess wiping the sperm off her groin, in her heartless promiscuity, in the anthology of humiliation that she offers her husband. Art as a way of self-transcendence, rather than the vengeful obliteration of others or sneaking suppression of the tattletale self that we find in the original of Laura. And death as a possible release from the confines of the self, but not an erasing of the self like Philip Wilde's, or an evasion of its limits like Flora's. Nabokov offers us, in the suppleness and speed of our imaginations, as he sends us hurtling along the black trails of his story, a route beyond the rapacity of the sexual self in Flora, or the stagnation of the cerebral self in Philip. And if we invert his inversions, a sense of being somehow, somewhere, connected with other states of being where art, curiosity, tenderness, kindness, ecstasy is the norm.
Good evening. I'm Martin Amis. Now, I had a very nice relationship with my father. But when I went to see, I never met Nabokov, but when I went to see Vera and Dmitri joined us for the day in Montreux, I got the sense of a tremendous equilateral triangle of love between the three of them. The last letter Nabokov wrote was to his son, and it begins, "My dearest," and it ends, "I love you, I'm proud of you, be well, my beloved." And indeed, I second that and bid Dmitri all my best and all my get well or get better soons. And there can't be any parent here in this hall who hasn't felt what Nabokov puts into words in the novel Ben Sinister about his little boy. And we've all felt glimmers of this, and as always, it takes a great genius to articulate it, where he says of his child, and what agony he thought. We all feel this when we see our children grow. And what agony he thought to love so madly a little creature formed in some mysterious fashion by the fusion of two mysteries, or rather two sets of 1 trillion of mysteries each, formed by a fusion which is, at the same time, a matter of choice, a matter of chance, and a matter of pure enchantment. Then thus formed and then permitted to accumulate trillions of its own mysteries, the whole suffused with consciousness, which is the only real thing in the world and the greatest mystery of all. I'm tempted tonight to concentrate on the comic Nabokov, because that's the greatest fun, and he always did stress fun as part of the reading experience. He was a great proponent and champion of the pleasure principle, but I find I'm going to read or concentrate on the tragic Nabokov, which is very ample and powerful side of his work. And in fact, we're going to head towards the Holocaust and his extremely diffident and tender and very limited writing on this subject. He, as far as I know, to my not quite perfect knowledge, he said very little about it in his fiction, but there are amazing things that he says about the Holocaust. But this is a story. I'm going to start with just an incredible, dementedly talented 6-page story called Signs and Symbols, which will head us in the right direction. Now, in the story, an quite elderly couple go to see their son, who is by now late adolescent and incurably deranged. And they set off on a rainy morning, and it's his birthday, and they've spent a lot of time wondering what to give him, because many things frighten him. And they settle on, quote, a dainty and innocent trifle, a basket with 10 different fruit jellies in 10 little jars. By the time of his birth, he says, filling in the backstory, they were both quite old, and the mother, unlike other women of her age, presented a naked white countenance to the fault-finding light of spring days. And her husband, who in the old country had been a fairly successful businessman, was now wholly dependent on his brother. They're in America, and they take the underground train, and that goes wrong, and they're trapped in the station. It was raining hard as they walked up the brown path leading to the sanitarium, where their son has been confined for many years. They waited again, and they were told that that their son had again attempted to commit suicide, and so they leave without seeing him. Quote, she waited for her husband to open his umbrella and then took his arm. He kept clearing his throat in a special resonant way he had when he was upset. They reached the bus stop. It was a long ride. The last time their son had tried to take his life, his method had been, in the doctor's words, a masterpiece of inventiveness. He would have succeeded had not an envious fellow patient thought he was learning to fly and stopped him. An envious fellow patient. He's always using words in strange applications, unexpected, striking, funny applications, like when Humbert loses sight of Lolita and then finds her quite innocently staring at a man at a tourist spot who is having a lavish epileptic fit. Now, here is an incredible description of what is wrong with the boy. He's got what's called referential mania. In these very rare cases, the patient imagines that everything happening around him is a veiled reference to his personality and existence. Phenomenal nature shadows him wherever he goes. Clouds in the staring sky transmit to one another by means of slow signs incredibly detailed information regarding him. His inmost thoughts are discussed at nightfall in manual alphabet by darkly gesticulating trees. Pebbles or stains or sunflecks form patterns representing in some awful way messages which he must intercept. Everything is a cipher, and of everything he is the theme. Some of the spies are detached observers, such as glass surfaces and still pools. Others, such as coats in store windows, are prejudiced witnesses, lynchers at heart. Others again, running water, storms, are hysterical to the point of insanity, have a distorted opinion of him, and grotesquely misinterpret his actions. He must be always on his guard and devote every minute and module of life to the decoding of the undulation of things. The very air he exhales is indexed and filed away. If the only interest he provokes were limited to his immediate surroundings, but alas, it is not. With distance, the torrents of wild scandal increase in volume and volubility. The silhouettes of his blood corpuscles, magnified 1,000,000 times, flit over vast plains, and still farther, great mountains of unbearable solidity and height, sum up in terms of granite and groaning firs the ultimate truth of his being. The old couple emerged from the foul air and the thunder of the underground, and it's already dusk, and she goes to buy supper, and he goes to the small apartment and realizes that she's took the key earlier in the day. And this is a marvelous bit of Nabokovian unflinchingness. They entered their two-room flat, and he at once went to the mirror, straining the corners of his mouth apart by means of his thumbs. With a horrible mask-like grimace, he removed his new, hopelessly uncomfortable dental plate and severed the long tusks of saliva connecting him to it. He reads his paper. She looks through some old photographs. Suddenly he reappears, having tried to sleep, and he's full of plans, and he says, "We've been doing it all wrong, and we should have the boy come and live with us." And then the story's over in a minute, and the telephone rings 3 times, and it's someone, a young girl, with a wrong number. And the old man is looking at the present they took to the boy. His clumsy, moist lips spelled out their eloquent labels: apricot, grape, beach plum, quince. He'd got to crabapple when the telephone rang again. That's the end of the story, but as so often in Nabokov, the emotional climax comes on 2 pages earlier when she's looking through the photographs. And suddenly she suddenly thought of the endless waves of pain that for some reason or other she and her husband had to endure, of the invisible giants hurting her boy in some unimaginable fashion, of the incalculable amount of tenderness contained in the world, of the fate of this tenderness, which is either crushed or wasted or transformed into madness, of neglected children humming to themselves in unswept corners, of beautiful weeds that cannot hide from the farmer and helplessly have to watch the shadow of his simian stoop leave mangled flowers in its wake as the monstrous darkness approaches. Now this story has a Nabokovian trademark, which is genius expressed in a single sentence. Now, there are many examples of that in Nabokov. Sometimes it's purely descriptive, as in Pale Fire when Kinbote is crawling down a secret tunnel. Sentence. A sick bat crept past, like a cripple with a broken umbrella. The bit in Lolita where Humbert is working himself into a fury, sneering at the kind of men that Lolita likes to look at in her ridiculous magazines. And he says, goons in luxurious cars, maroon morons near blued pools. I mean, maroon morons is sufficiently good, but blued pools. Blue pools is no good because you've got to prolong the assonance, so blued pools. This incredible description in Pnin of what we would now call empty nest syndrome. I'm now moving on to the one-sentence demonstrations of genius that actually, apart from being beautiful, are also rather brainy. This middle-aged couple, the Clementses, have just presided over their daughter's wedding, and now she no longer lives with them. The Clemenses felt dejected, apprehensive, and lonely in their nice old draughty house that now seemed to hang about them like the flabby skin and flapping clothes of some fool who had gone and lost a third of his weight. All this from the little novella The Eye on suicide. And the young hero's been humiliated, and he's decided that he's going to kill himself. So he sits down to write out his will and send some last letters. But then he realized that to sit down and write some final letters, but that would be an act just as absurd as winding up one's watch, since together with the man, the whole world is destroyed. The last letter is instantly reduced to dust, and with it all the postman. And like smoke, vanishes the estate bequeathed to a non-existent progeny. The idea that all the postmen disappear is pure genius. The sentence in Signs and Symbols, this marvelous little short story we've just been through, is about the Holocaust. And it occurs when the mother is looking through the album, and we're getting these little snapshots of various people in their past. And the characters are introduced, the boy at 10, Uncle David. Then we come to Aunt Rosa, a fussy, angular, wild-eyed old lady who had lived in a tremulous world of bad news, bankruptcies, train accidents, cancerous growths, until the Germans put her to death, together with all the people she had worried about. They had taken care of that. It's important to understand that the Holocaust was tremendously immediate to the Nabokovs. It was a marvelous life he had from the outside. It consisted of 4 roughly 20-year-long chunks. Pre-revolutionary Russia. Then where does he escapes the revolution? And it's that marvelous story of him he was a 16-year-old millionaire in his own right, having inherited an independent fortune from his uncle, and was due to inherit millions more, although he always said he looked with amusement and contempt at people who regarded the revolution as just defrauding them of their money. He had no interest in that at all. But he was a proud young man, and he was 18, I think, as they were fleeing the Soviet Union as it was about to become. And Nabokov was on a train station, and there was his mother and his brothers inside the train, with jewels in their hair, hidden in their hair. And people were being shot all over the place at this point. And the train pulled up, I think, in the Crimea. And Nabokov, a young dandy and poet and tremendous womanizer already, sauntered onto the station where a lot of scowling soldiers and proletarians sneered at him and were muttering among themselves. He always said pride was a great virtue. He's not like the heroes of our neurasthenic, cramped, furtive fiction. He was proud, and he began to saunter up and down the platform while the train prepared to move on, with rather sort of showy twirls of his silver-topped cane. And then he dropped it, and it rolled under the train, and about halfway down the train. So a crisis for a young man of his nature, and all the soldiers were laughing at him and so on. So he stood there and waited, and the train started to move. It passed over where his cane had fallen. He jumped down and retrieved it, and then began to run at a lazy saunter at first after the train. This saunter became a desperate, lung-bursting sprint. And he got tremendously close to the train, and then the distance began decisively to widen. And at this point, as he writes in Speak Memory, more in keeping with romantic fiction than with socialist realism, a brawny proletarian hand appeared out of the caboose and yanked him on board. But let us remember just how closely caught up he was with these events. This is an amazing quote, I think. A liberal of noble family, the son of a former Tsarist minister, almost symbolic in his self-satisfied correctness and dry egotism. This is a description of Nabokov's father by Trotsky, who bloodthirstily notes that Nabokov Sr. was, quote, finally killed by the stray bullet of a white guard in Berlin. I love that, finally. You know, someone had to do it. Trotsky wanted to do it, but someone finally did it for him. And in fact, Nabokov's father was shot dead by a fascist thug at a meeting in Berlin in the early 20s while he was trying to protect his friend from an assassin's bullet. Nabokov's brother, Sergei, homosexual brother, was murdered in a concentration camp, Nazi concentration camp. This is a quote from a letter from Nabokov to his sister Elena in November 1945, written from the USA to the USSR. What a joy you are well, alive, in good spirits. Poor, poor Seroja, ... exclamation mark. That's his brother. Nabokov's Jewish wife, Vera, who had lived through in the 20s before going to Berlin and meeting Nabokov there for the first time, had lived through an absolutely cataclysmic pogrom in the Ukraine where 100,000 Jews were killed. They were on the last boat out of France with the Wehrmacht 70 miles from Paris. And that boat on its next trip was torpedoed and sank with everyone lost on board. And had the Nabokovs remained in France, it is tremendously strong likelihood that they would have been among the scores of thousands of undesirables delivered by Vichy to the Reich. So a great gain in immediacy when we think about this. And references to the Holocaust in the novels are usually glancing, as in that short story in that sentence I just quoted. But you see it simmering around on the edges of his consciousness. And this, in my view, is the central paragraph from Lolita. And it controls the morality of the whole novel, because who would ever want to do something that gave them dreams like this? This is the recurring dream that Humbert has after Lolita has flown, when she absconds with the cynically carnal Quilty. Now, this is an absolutely terrifying description of a dream. She did haunt my sleep, but she appeared there in strange and ludicrous disguises, as Valeria or Charlotte, his ex-wives, or a cross between them. That complex ghost would come to me, shedding shift after shift, in an atmosphere of great melancholy and disgust, and would recline in dull invitation on some narrow board or hard settee, with flesh ajar like the rubber valve of a soccer ball's bladder. I would find myself in horrible chambre garnie, where I would be entertained at tedious vivisecting parties that generally ended with Charlotte or Valeria weeping in my bleeding arms and being tenderly kissed by my brotherly lips in a dream disorder of auctioneered Viennese bric-a-brac, pity, impotence, and the brown wigs of tragic old women who had just been gassed. In Pnin, there's an émigré house party in rural America, and a Madame Spoliansky mentions her cousin, Myra, and asks Timothy Pnin if he has heard of her terrible end. "Indeed I have," Pnin answers. And then gentle Timothy sits on alone in the twilight, and Nabokov, in one of those miraculous expansions, gives us this. What chatty Madame Spoliansky mentioned had conjured up Myra's image with unusual force. This was disturbing. Only in the detachment of an incurable complaint, in the sanity of near death, could one cope with this for a moment. There's more, but I'd just like to say that this exactly chimes with something, a key remark of Primo Levi's, which was a great comfort to me, because I find that as I get older and the more I know about the Holocaust, the less I understand it. And there's a bit in where Primo Levi is replying to the questions he is most often asked. Someone says, "Do you understand the Holocaust?" And he said, "No, I don't, and I think there's a duty not to understand it. To understand something is to contain it, and this we cannot and should not do, because what happened was counterhuman." This is what Levi says. It is so anti-counter-human that human beings must reject it, and I found myself very much assenting to that. Now, I'm going to read the end of this paragraph first. He's thinking about Myra. "And since the exact form of her death had not been recorded, Myra kept dying a great number of deaths in one's mind, and undergoing a great number of resurrections, only to die again and again, led away by a trained nurse, inoculated with filth, tetanus bacilli, broken glass, gassed in a sham shower bath with prussic acid, burned alive in a pit on a gasoline-soaked pile of beechwood." According to the investigator Pnin had happened to talk to in Washington, the only certain thing was that, being too weak to work, though still smiling, still able to help other Jewish women, she was selected to die and was cremated only a few days after her arrival in Buchenwald, in the beautifully wooded Große Ettersberg, as the region is resoundingly called. It is an hour's stroll from Weimar, where walked Goethe, Herder, Schiller, Wieland, the inimitable Kotzebue, and others. But why Dr. Hagen, the gentlest of souls alive, why would wail? Why had one to put that horrid camp so near? For indeed it was near, only 5 miles from the cultural heart of Germany, that nation of universities, as the president of Wendell College had so elegantly phrased it. Now, if we return to the beginning of the paragraph, had conjured up Myra's image with unusual force. This was disturbing. Only in the detachment of an incurable complaint, in the sanity of near death, could one cope with this for a moment. In order to exist rationally, Pnin had taught himself during the last 10 years never to remember Myra Bolochkin. Not because in itself the evocation of a youthful love affair, banal and brief, threatened his peace of mind, but because, if one were quite sincere with oneself, no conscience and hence no consciousness could be expected to subsist in a world where such things as Myra's death were possible. One had to forget because one could not live with the thought that this graceful, fragile, tender young woman with those eyes, that smile, those gardens and snows in the background, had been brought in a cattle car to an extermination camp and killed by an injection of phenol into the heart, into the gentle heart one had heard beating under one's lips in the dusk of the past. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Chip Kidd. I'm a book designer, and I'm the comic relief. So I'm gonna start with several of Nabokov's reactions to cover designs that were sent to him. Brace yourself. All right, so this is to somebody named Heather Mansell at Penguin in 1968. Completely unacceptable. This corny caricature is meaningless, badly drawn and repulsive. Panine is an attractive and an admirable person. One possibility of replacing that cartoon would be to use the very charming design on the cover of the paperback edition published by Avon Publications, Inc., 575 Madison Avenue, New York, New York. If you can acquire it from them, or just omit picture altogether. All right, now with most of these, they were rejected, so I don't have anything to show. So this is going way back to 1940 for conclusive evidence to some hapless person named John Fisher at Harper's. Time is passing, and I still have not seen either blurb, jacket, or binding. Who is designing the jacket? I trust there is no Russian stuff. Churches, pagodas, samovars being considered. I am raising this question only because I have had something of the sort inflicted upon me by an English outsider. Okay, Pale Fire, 1962, letter to Barley Allison. I am sorry to say that I find the jacket design for Pale Fire with the mauve beatnik horrible, disgusting, and tasteless. If I have any say in the matter, I would like to insist that it be as plain as possible, with no pictorial effects, and in the same style as the American edition. The lettering is hideous. It should be large, simple, and very black. Now remember that last sentence. Okay, and Ada, 1969, letter to Oliver Caldecott. Your artist's cypripedium looks like a ghastly vulva. This is almost like a poem. And the pus moth, caterpillar, is all wrong. And, moreover, does not breed on orchids. I am emphatically against this symbolic design. I want 3 or 4 non-anatomical, genuine orchids, prettily colored, garlanded around ADA. Why don't you simply use the drawing of the 3 species I made for you? Possibly multiplying and stylizing them, but not Freudianizing them. Those innocent blossoms. On the other hand, if you cannot reproduce, or don't wish to bother with, the reproduction of an elegant, old-fashioned vignette for my elegant, old-fashioned novel, with delicate contours and tender tints, then I would prefer you to cancel all idea of a pictorial design and replace it with plain lettering. Just my name and Ada would be enough. So keep that in mind, too. So, I can say I'm glad that I started designing Nabokov books after he was dead. My first go-around was for a Brazilian publisher in Sao Paulo called Companhia das Letras, who approached me to do a series of Nabokov books. And I was very excited because I'm a huge Nabokov fan, and this was my chance to do it because I had not been asked to do it in the English edition. So now, the thing with Companhia is they're terrific, but they don't publish hardcover. They publish strictly paperbacks. Which was a little bit different for me, but they are paper. But other than that, they would go the extra mile in terms of production. So they were paperbacks with flaps, and then I introduced this sort of like peekaboo feature, what we call a belly band. So this is Speak Memory, and so we're looking at 2 different pieces of paper here. The blue part underneath is removable. And so there he is at age, 3 or whatever, back in Russia. And so if you want him to speak, then you just remove the paper band, and there he is. And so his mouth is freed up, and you can do that. So, this was all approved by Dmitri. And so this is a novel called Mary. It's his first novel. And part of one of the features of the novel is that she's talked about, but she's never seen, actually. And so in order to see her again, you have to remove the paper, and there she is. But she's still very much a mystery. This is a collection of short stories. The title story is Perfection, and it features a little boy who pretends to drown himself and his tutor who goes in to save him, and of course ends up actually drowning. And so the belly band now is the water that is consuming them, and when you remove that, then you get the teacher who's trying to get a hold of him, hold him. And of course, Panine. This centered on a photograph that I found that I sort of couldn't resist using, and I'm sure, having read what I just read, he would have hated this. Because when you, and it takes place at a school, so now the belly band is sort of like notebook paper, and when you take it off, there he is, not looking terribly attractive, unless you're a foot fetishist. And, of course, this was the most fun. And there she is, and you're staring at her and thinking, ooh, if I could only slip off that plaid bra. But instead you slip off the belly band and you get... No. You Claire Quilty you. So that's I did a couple more. I think I did Pale Fire and some other ones for them, but they were really terrific. And again, Dmitri was really terrific for approving all of that. I'm going to give a plug for a new series of repackaged Nabokov backlist for Vintage. I work for Knopf Publishing. Vintage is our trade paperback arm, and the art director for Vintage is this brilliant guy named John Gall, And he got the idea of, let's do a designer invitational of specimen boxes, because Nabokov was so into butterflies. And so they picked a list of about 20 graphic designers, and everybody was sent a little specimen box about this big and a set of pins. And the rule was, it was like everybody got assigned a different book, obviously. And so for your book, you could not use any paste or adhesive of any kind. Everything that you made had to be made out of paper and then pinned into the specimen box. And so I don't know if these are out yet. I know the first wave of them is printed, but they're going to be out in like 2 seconds. So we're going to look at a couple of these. This is Speak Memory by a designer named Michael Beirut, who I have shared this very stage with. And he's a partner at Pentagram, and his concept is that you're looking through a piece of semi-translucent paper, so that the memory literally becomes a bit fuzzy as you're looking through it. This is a designer I work with, one of my best friends, a woman named Barbara DeWilde. The stories, and so, very simple concept of each of them, being very different, but they sort of go together to make the title. Here's a woman named Karen Goldberg doing Panine and his signature bow tie. This is a wonderful designer named Stephen Doyle. Pretty self-explanatory. The interesting thing is that the smoke itself is printed on the base paper, and then the match is an actual match that's got a tack through it. So it's very dimensional, but line the camera upright, and it looks like the smoke's coming out of it. And then this is John Gall himself, the eye, one of the ones that he did. And then the one that I did, this is a designer named Paul Saar. I have not read this book, but apparently it all falls apart at the end. And then this is mine, which is Ada, and I actually had not read this before. Just my name and Ada would be enough, but there it is. And this was actually far more difficult than it looks, because each of the letters had to be layered, and it was like building a little ship in a bottle or what have you. But Otter or Ardor, and it goes into infinity. So that's the new Nabokov series from Vintage, and there's many, many more, and they're really a delight. And again, Dmitri was totally behind this, and we're very grateful to him for that. And so to designing the book at hand, the original of Laura, I had certainly read in the media about this, and but I had no idea, perhaps naively, that Knopf was in the running to publish it. And then I got the mysterious email, Sonny Mehta would like to see you in his office, and which is never fun if you're not anticipating it. It's sort of like going to see the principal. And but up I went, and he said, we're going to publish this, and your job is to figure out how to take 138 note cards and turn them into a book. And I was very, very eager for the challenge. And I literally, for years, in interviews, people would say, you've been designing books for over 20 years. What is it that you would like to do that you haven't done? And at the top of my list, I would say, I would like to design a Nabokov first edition. And I know I'll never be able to. And there it is. And so here we go. This is the last one. And again, there's been, as Sonny would say, controversy over should we be doing this. And, it's funny. Like, I'm a huge fan, and I wanted to see this. And, artists publish sketchbooks all the time, even posthumously, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. And that's really how I approach this. Here were the sketches for what was going to be the last novel. Why wouldn't people want to see this? I mean, he was one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. What's the problem? What's wrong? I did the same thing for Charles Schulz. The year after he died, I contacted his widow and his children, and I said, I want to do the posthumous Charles Schulz book. And I went to his studio, and I dug through all of his drawings that he never wanted anybody to see, and I photographed them and published them. Why not? I mean, he was a genius too, and I'm a huge fan, and people would want to see this. So that's how I approach this. It's like we're publishing an artifact. So, being a book cover designer primarily, although I'm designing the whole book, I'm going to start with the cover. And as I guess you've discerned, it's about this author who literally is erasing himself. He wants to, remove himself from the world. Now, I don't want to try and do any literal depictions of anything, of a person trying to do this to themselves on the front of the book. That's just not a smart way to go. I think let's set it up in typography and then create an effect that's going to achieve this. So this was my first go at it. And my original fading of this was much more severe. The fading actually started even farther back, like about halfway through. And I was showing this around, and the agent said, I'm sorry, it now says Vladimir Nabokov, the Ori of Law. And that just won't do. And I said, okay, so with all the attending publicity of this book, do you really think there will be any confusion whatsoever of who wrote it and what it's called? Anyway, so this was our compromise. And, but Sonny, ever the wise, said, I think this is interesting. Did you think of black? And I said, well, let's give it a whirl. And this actually makes a lot more sense. And this is what we ended up with. And what kind of shocked me is after having designed book covers nonstop for 23 years, I'd never faded to black, ever. Why? It's such a natural impulse. I do it every night. And yet, that's kind of what this character is doing. And P.S., it's beautiful. You get an instant emotional reaction to what you're seeing. And so that was that. Now, again, I'm a strong believer in the spine should be as strong as the front, so that if you're having trouble reading this, you can look on the spine. And I'm sorry. When you take the cover off on the binding, this is what you see, and this is the last card. This is the last thing he wrote. The efface, expunge, erase, delete, rub out, wipe out, obliterate. And so there's the spine of the jacket. So now, that's fading out too, but it's fading out in a different way. So it's putting together some clues that you may not get from the front. And then when you take that off, I turned the first card in the series on its side. So I want to stick as close to his original material as possible and putting his name on the top and the Knopf at the bottom. But otherwise, it's all him. He actually did it. And then this is the title page spread, bringing back the white. One of the things about the black and the white, which I will say, is there were practical considerations in terms of just scuffing, basically. Because I did not want this jacket to be glossy. I did not want to give it the wet look, which is the gloss film lamination. I wanted it to be like real paper that doesn't have any plastic on top of it. So what that means is it looks better, but if it's white, it will scuff like crazy. If it's black, it will absorb the grease from your fingers. So that's actually something to think about. But I can then do the white on the inside, which is what you're seeing there. Okay, so then how to deal with the cards and how to make the cards into a book. And there was all sorts of exploratory production stuff done by our brilliant production editor, Andy Hughes, who is great. But it was almost like, okay, we'll package the cards, so you get the cards in this box, and then you get a booklet that goes with it that has the typographic translation of the cards next to it, and we'll package that in a box, and yay. And it was becoming too gifty, and it was becoming too novelty. And I wanted it, frankly, to sit next to the volume of the complete stories, which we had previously published. And so I said, no, let's keep it in that format, but we're going to use extra thick paper, and the thing about the cards is they're numbered until they're not. So they're numbered about 3/4 of the way through, and then they're just cards. And that was the way he worked. He would rearrange them as he was writing them. That's the whole point of doing it on cards. And so I said, how about if we set the whole thing up in the order that we get them, but they'll all be perforated so that you can punch them out and rearrange them yourself if you want to. Now, this tradition, for me, goes back to my childhood with punch-out books. This is the Captain Marvel punch-out book. And again, it's the whole idea that you get all these things on a two-dimensional plane, and then you punch them out, and then you can stand them up and bring them into 3 dimensions, which I just loved. Again, like they're all die-cut and punched out. And of course, Batman was even more fun. So you can't really see it, but they're all perforated. And so this was a great sort of activity for me, very young growing up. So now I'm going to bring it to a whole new audience who can punch out these cards and rearrange them. And of course, the question I kept getting is, do you really think anyone's going to punch out the cards from this book? And I said, no. Of course they're not. It's a $35 book. I mean, maybe they'll buy 2 of them and do it to one of them. But the point is they can if they want to. And so then it becomes this conceptual thing of no, I'm not going to, but I could. And look at that, it's perforated, and becomes like it becomes a very sort of sensual, textural experience. And then we had to figure out, like, initially the background of the page was going to be black too, but people don't like to read white type on a black background, so then it became gray with black type. And then how do you set up the type? Do you put it on the facing page? Well, you can't, because that cards could be punched out as well. So here, this is the first one, and you turn it, and so you're getting the back of the original card on the other side, in which he had written an X on a lot of them. So then there's the second one, which then just leads to the third, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I will say, if you do get the book and you punch all the cards out, you get a secret surprise at the end. Very important, the secret surprise. And I won't give it away here, but it's pretty great. Anyway, so this was just a dream come true for me, and Dimitri was totally with it and got it, and I'm very grateful to him and to Sonny and Knopf for allowing me to do it. And I'm just going to end with the final rear end paper when you finish the book, and the subtitle, of course, is "Dying is Fun." And I don't know if this reads really well, but you sort of fade, and then you fade again. So there it is, and thank you very much.
Me again. 2 more hard acts to follow. I have a better scriptwriter this time. Chip was wrong, I think, suggesting that, wishing that being happy that he wasn't doing covers when Nabokov was alive. I think Nabokov would have been thrilled to have seen Chip's covers, and I think it's if he's up there and was frowning at the idea of publishing the original of Laura, he would have been very happy to have seen how it was done. So here we have the original of Laura itself, and Bernhard Schwartz typed out for me the text that I'm going to read, but I got so used to reading it in the Xeroxes of the original that I can't do anything but look at the original index cards and read from Nabokov's handwriting. So if there's a stumble here or two, it's because Nabokov's erased too heavily, but I hope you'll forgive him for that. So the original of Laura, I'll start with chapter 1, and then I'll move into a non-Flora section. Her husband, she answered, was a writer too, at least after a fashion. Fat men beat their wives, it is said, and he certainly looked fierce when he caught her riffling through his papers. He pretended to slam down a marble paperweight and crush this weak little hand, displaying the little hand in febrile motion. Actually, she was searching for a silly business letter, and not in the least trying to decipher his mysterious manuscript. Oh no, it was not a work of fiction which one dashes off, to make money. It was a mad neurologist's testament, a kind of poisonous opus, as in that film. It had cost him and would still cost him years of toil, but the thing was, of course, an absolute secret. If she mentioned it at all, she added, it was because she was drunk. She wished to be taken home, or preferably to some quiet place with a clean bed and room service. She wore a strapless gown and slippers of black velvet. Her bare insteps were as white as her young shoulders. The party seemed to have degenerated into a lot of sober eyes, staring at her with nasty compassion from every corner, every cushion and ashtray, and even from the hills of the spring night framed in the open French window. Mrs. Carr, her hostess, repeated what a pity it was that Philip could not come, or rather, that Flora could not have induced him to come. I'll drug him next time, said Flora, rummaging all around her seat for a small, formless vanity bag, a blind black puppy. Here it is, cried an anonymous girl, squatting quickly. Mrs. Carr's nephew, Anthony Carr, and his wife, Winnie, were one of those easygoing, over-generous couples that positively crave to lend their flat to a friend, any friend, when they and their dog do not happen to need it. Flora spotted at once the alien creams in the bathroom and the open can of Fido's Feast next to the naked cheese in the cluttered fridge. A brief set of instructions pertaining to the superintendent and the charwoman ended on, ring up my aunt, Emily Carr, which evidently had been already done to lamentation in heaven and laughter in hell. The double bed was made, but was unfresh inside. With comic fastidiousness, Flora spread her fur coat over it before undressing and lying down. Where was the damned valise that had been brought up earlier? In the vestibule closet. Had everything to be shaken out before the pair of Morocco slippers could be located, fetally folded in their zippered pouch? Hiding under the shaving kit. All the towels in the bathroom, whether pink or green, were of a thick, soggy-looking, spongy-like texture. Let us choose the smallest. On the way back, the distal edge of the right slipper lost its grip and had to be pried at the grateful heel with a finger for shoeing horn. "Oh, hurry up," she said softly. That first surrender of hers was a little sudden, if not downright unnerving. A pause for some light caresses, concealed embarrassment, feigned amusement, prefatory contemplation. She was an extravagantly slender girl. Her ribs showed. The conspicuous knobs of her hip bones framed a hollow abdomen, so flat as to belie the notion of belly. Her exquisite bone structure immediately slipped into a novel, became, in fact, the secret structure of that novel, besides supporting a number of poems. The cup-sized breasts of that 24-year-old impatient beauty seemed a dozen years younger than she, with those pale, squinty nipples and firm form. Her painted eyelids were closed. A tear of no particular meaning gemmed the hard top of her cheek. Nobody could tell what went on in that little head. Waves of desire rippled there. A recent lover fell back in a swoon. Hygienic doubts were raised and dismissed. Contempt for everyone but herself advertised with a flush of warmth its constant presence. "Here it is," cried what's-her-name, squatting quickly. "My darling, duszka moja." Eyebrows went up, eyes opened and closed again. She didn't meet Russians often. This should be pondered. Masking her face, coating her side, pinaforing her stomach with kisses, all very acceptable while they remained dry. Her frail, docile frame, when turned over by hand, revealed new marvels. The mobile omoplates of a child being tubbed, the incurvation of a ballerina's spine, narrow naties of an ambiguous, irresistible charm, nature's beastliest bluff, said Paul de G., watching a dour old Don, watching boys bathing. Only by identifying her with an unwritten, half-written, rewritten, difficult book could one hope to render at last what contemporary descriptions of intercourse so seldom convey, because newborn and thus generalized, in the sense of primitive organisms of art, as opposed to the perennial achievement of great English poets dealing with an evening in the country, a bit of sky and a river, the nostalgia of remote sounds, things utterly beyond the reach of Homer or Horace. Readers are directed to that book on a very high shelf, in a very bad light, but already existing as magic exists and death, and as shall exist from now on, the mouth she made automatically while using that towel to wipe her thighs after the promised withdrawal. A copy of Glist's dreadful landscape, receding ovals, adorned the wall, vital and serene, according to Philistine Flora. Auroral rumbles and bangs had begun jolting the cold, misty city. She consulted the onyx eye on her wrist. It was too tiny and not costly enough for its size to go right, she said, translating from Russian. And it was the first time in her stormy life that she knew anyone take off his watch to make love. "But I'm sure it's sufficiently late to ring up another fellow," stretching her swift, cruel arm toward the bedside telephone. She who mislaid everything dialed fluently a long number. "You were asleep? I've shattered your sleep? That's what you deserve. Now listen carefully." And with tigerish zest, monstrously magnifying a trivial tiff she had had with him whose pyjamas, the idiot subject of the tiff, were changing the while in the spectrum of his surprise and distress from heliotrope to a sickly grey, she dismissed the poor oaf forever. "That's done," she said, resolutely replacing the receiver. Was I game now for another round, she wanted to know. No? Not even a quickie? Well, tant pis. Try to find me some liquor in their kitchen and then take me home. The position of her head, its trustful proximity, its gratefully shouldered weight, the tickle of her hair endured all through the drive. Yet she was not asleep, and with the greatest exactitude had the taxi stop to let her out at the corner of Heine Street, not too far from, nor too close to, her house. This was an old villa backed by tall trees. In the shadows of a side alley, a young man with a Macintosh over his white pyjamas was wringing his hands. The streetlights were going out in alternate order, the odd numbers first. Along the pavement in front of the villa, her obese husband in a rumpled black suit and tartan booties with clasps was walking a striped cat on an overlong leash. She made for the front door. Her husband followed, now carrying the cat. The scene might be called somewhat incongruous. The animal seemed naively fascinated by the snake trailing behind on the ground. Not wishing to harness herself to futurity, she declined to discuss another rendezvous. To prod her slightly, a messenger called at her domicile 3 days later. He bought from the favourite florist of fashionable girls a banal bevy of bird-of-paradise flowers. Cora, the mulatto chambermaid who let him in, surveyed the shabby courier, his comic cap, his wan countenance with its 3 days' growth of blonde beard, and was about to raise her chin and embrace his rustling load. But he said, "No, I've been ordered to give this to Madame herself." "You French?" asked scornful Cora. The whole scene was pretty artificial in a fishy, theatrical way. He shook his head, and here Madame appeared from the breakfast room. First of all, she dismissed Cora with the strelitzias, hateful blooms, regalized bananas, really. "Look," she said to the beaming bum, "if you ever repeat this idiotic performance, I will never see you again. I swear I won't. In fact, I have a great mind." He flattened her against the wall between his outstretched arms. Flora ducked and freed herself and showed him the door, but the telephone was already ringing ecstatically when he reached his lodgings. So that was chapter 1. And just one more sample, because we've been too garrulous. And that's from a section which no longer has a chapter number, but has Nabokov's private letter code, and these go up to Z, which is the not at the very end, but what is presumably the last chapter. But this is D, which may stand for another word, perhaps. And this is less finalized than the first chapter, so occasionally there is a little note to himself, and there's a kind of fade out like Chip's cover and Nabokov's life. Settling for a single line. The student who desires to die should learn, first of all, to project a mental image of himself upon his inner blackboard. This surface, which at its virgin best has a dark plum rather than black depth of opacity, is none other than the underside of one's closed eyelids. To ensure a complete smoothness of background, care must be taken to eliminate the hypnagogic gargoyles and entoptic swarms which plague tired vision after a surfeit of poring over a collection of coins or insects. Sound sleep and an eye bath should be enough to cleanse the locus. Now comes the mental image. In preparing for my own experiments, a long fumble which these notes shall help novices avoid, I toyed with the idea of drawing a fairly detailed, fairly recognizable portrait of myself on my private blackboard. I see myself in my closet glass as an obese bulk with formless features and a sad, porcine stare. But my visual imagination is nil. I'm quite unable to tuck Nigel Delling under my eyelid, let alone keeping him there in a fixed aspect of flesh for any length of time. I then tried various stylizations, a Delling-like doll, a sketchy skeleton. Or would the letters of my name do? Its recurrent I, coinciding with our favourite pronoun, suggested an elegant solution. A simple vertical line across my field of inner vision could be chalked in an instant, and what is more, I could mark lightly by transverse marks the three divisions of my physical self: legs, torso, and head. Several months have now gone since I began working, not every day and not for protracted periods, on the upright line emblemizing me. Soon, with a strong thumb of thought, I could rub out its base, which corresponded to my joined feet. Being new to the process of self-deletion, I attributed the ecstatic relief of getting rid of my toes, as represented by the white pedicule I was erasing with more than masturbatory joy, to the fact that I suffered torture ever since the sandals of childhood were replaced by smart shoes, whose very polish reflected pain and poison. So what a delight it was to amputate my tiny feet. Yes, tiny, yet I always wanted them, roly-poly dandy that I am, to seem even smaller. The daytime footwear always hurt, always hurt. I waddled home from work and replaced the agony of my dapper Oxfords by the comfort of old bed slippers. This act of mercy inevitably drew from me a voluptuous sigh, which my wife, whenever I imprudently let her hear it, denounced as vulgar, disgusting, obscene. Because she was a cruel lady, or because she thought I might be clowning on purpose to irritate her, she once hid my slippers. Hid them furthermore in separate spots, as one does with delicate siblings in orphanages, especially on chilly nights. But I forthwith went out and bought 20 pairs of soft carpet toes, while hiding my tear-staining face under a Father Christmas mask, which frightened the shopgirls. For a moment, I wondered with some apprehension if the deletion of my procreative system might produce nothing much more than a magnified orgasm. I was relieved to discover that the process continued sweet death's ineffable sensation, which had nothing in common with ejaculation or sneezes. The 3 or 4 times that I reached that stage, I forced myself to restore the lower half of my white eye on my mental blackboard and thus wriggle out of my perilous trance. I, Philip Wilde, lecturer in experimental psychology, University of Ganglia, suffered for the last 17 years from a humiliating stomach ailment which severely limited the jollities of companionship in small dining rooms. I loathe my belly, that trunk full of bowels which I have to carry around, and everything connected with it, the wrong food, heartburn, constipation's leaden load, or else indigestion with a first instalment of hot filth pouring out of me in a public toilet 3 minutes before a punctual engagement. And there's a little